Where do I even start? My ex-fiancée, Sarah, broke up with me out of nowhere, and honestly, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. We'd been together for nearly 5 years, planning a wedding, building a life, or so I thought. Then one evening, she sits me down and says we need to talk. You know how it goes. Those 4 words that instantly make your stomach drop. She tells me she wants to break up, and her reason? My job. I work at my uncle's Italian restaurant, a place that's been in our family for decades. I started bussing tables when I was a teenager, worked my way up to managing shifts, and now I'm basically running the place when my uncle isn't around. It's not glamorous, and the hours aren't great. I usually work evenings, late nights on weekends, but it's honest work, and I love it. It's always been a part of who I am. Sarah works a typical 9 to 5 office job, and yeah, our schedules don't exactly line up. She'd get home by 6 p.m., and I wouldn't walk through the door until after 10, sometimes later on weekends. But this wasn't new. She's known about my schedule since day one. When we started dating, when we moved in together, when I proposed, she knew. And for years, it didn't seem to bother her. But lately, she'd started bringing it up more and more. Little comments here and there, like, how long are you planning on staying in this job? Or, don't you ever want something more stable? At first, I brushed it off. Everyone gets stressed about work, and I figured she just needed some reassurance. But the comments kept coming. She'd say she felt lonely in the evenings, that she hated eating dinner alone. I tried to make it work. I'd wake up early on weekends so we could have breakfast together, or I'd plan dates during my mornings off. But it was never enough. A few months before she dropped the bomb, I even suggested she could come work at the restaurant part-time. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would mean more time together, and we'd both be saving money for the wedding. She shut that idea down immediately, said she'd feel uncomfortable working for my uncle and didn't want to mix work and our relationship. Fair enough, I respected that. But the complaints about my schedule didn't stop. So when she sat me down that night, I honestly thought it was going to be another one of those conversations. You know, the kind where she'd tell me how she feels neglected, and I'd promise to try harder. But this time was different. Her voice was steady, her expression calm, too calm. She told me she couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't keep waiting around for me to come home every night. She said she felt like she was living with a ghost, like she was planning a future with someone who wasn't fully present. I tried to reason with her. I told her I was committed. I mean, come on, we were planning a wedding. How much more committed could I get? But she just shook her head and said it wasn't enough, that she needed someone who was willing to make changes for their relationship. That stung, because from where I was standing, I was already giving everything I could. I worked long hours, not because I enjoyed being away from her, but because I was trying to build something stable for our future. I wasn't out partying or blowing money on stupid stuff. I was working. For us. But none of that seemed to matter. She had made up her mind, and honestly, it felt like she'd made it weeks ago. There was no fight, no yelling, just her sitting there, staring at me with those cold, rehearsed lines. At one point, I even asked her, point blank, if my job was such a problem for you, why did you agree to marry me in the first place? And you know what she said? That she thought I'd grow out of it. Like working in a family business was some phase I'd eventually outgrow, like acne or wearing ripped jeans. That's when I realized she didn't just want me to change jobs. She wanted me to change who I was. The days after that conversation were brutal. We didn't argue. We didn't cry. We just existed in this heavy silence. I'd go to work and stay late, just to avoid being in the same room with her. And every night, I'd come home and she'd still be there, sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, or watching TV, like nothing had happened. I don't know what I expected. Maybe I thought she'd start packing her things right away. I mean, when you break off an engagement, isn't that what you do? You figure out your next steps, maybe crash with a friend or go stay with family. But not Sarah. She just stayed. Finally, after almost a week of this weird limbo, I couldn't take it anymore. One night, I came home from work, dropped my keys on the counter, and told her straight up, Sarah, you need to move out. We're not together anymore, and I can't keep living like this. She looked at me like I just slapped her across the face, like I was the one who blindsided her. She started with the guilt trip. She had nowhere to go. It wasn't fair. I was being heartless. but I wasn't having it. I reminded her that her parents lived less than half an hour away, and she had friends she could stay with. She had options. That's when I brought up the ring. I didn't want to do it. It felt petty, honestly. But the ring was expensive, and it was supposed to symbolize our future together. No wedding, no ring. Simple as that. She flipped out, called me greedy, said I was heartless, told me I was being petty over something so small. But it wasn't small. It wasn't just about the money. It was about what the ring represented. In the end, she stormed off to the bedroom, slammed the door, and I just stood there in the kitchen, staring at the space where she'd been standing. I felt drained, angry, and completely lost. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought she'd pack her bags and leave in a day or two. But no, this was just the beginning of the mess that was about to unfold. The days after I told Sarah to move out were some of the most uncomfortable of my life. You'd think after a breakup, especially one where marriage was on the table, things would move quickly. She'd pack up her stuff, we'd have some emotional but final goodbye, and that would be it. But no, Sarah stayed. Not just physically, but in this strange limbo state where she acted like absolutely nothing had changed. She was still lounging on the couch every evening when I got home from work, still leaving her dishes in the sink, still walking around the apartment in my old hoodie like we were just another happy couple winding down after a long day. The only difference was that we barely spoke. It was like sharing a space with a ghost, one that was very much alive, eating my food and pretending like everything was fine. At first, I tried to be patient. I told myself, okay, maybe she just needs time to sort things out. Moving out isn't easy, and I wasn't trying to be heartless. But after about 4 days of this, I started to feel like I was being played. Every night I came home expecting her to say, hey, I found a place to stay, or at least, I'm going to crash with a friend for a bit. But no, nothing. One evening, I walked in after a long shift, and there she was, sitting cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through her phone while some reality show blared in the background. I stood there for a second, just watching her, trying to process how we'd gone from planning our wedding to whatever this was. Sarah, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, have you started looking for a place yet? She barely glanced up from her phone. I've been busy. Busy? Busy with what? She didn't have a second job, no major responsibilities outside of her 9 to 5. What exactly was taking up all her time? I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. Look, I'm not trying to be a jerk here, but this isn't working. You can't just stay here indefinitely. You broke up with me, remember? That got her attention. She set her phone down and looked at me like I was the one being unreasonable. Do you have any idea how hard this is for me? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Hard for her? The person who ended things? Who decided my job and my life weren't good enough? But I bit my tongue because I didn't want to start a screaming match in my living room. I get it, I said, trying my best to sound understanding. But this isn't fair to either of us. You need to figure something out, Sarah. Soon. She stared at me for a long moment before finally nodding. Fine. But, of course, nothing changed. The next night, I came home to find her talking to my mom on the phone, loudly, in my living room. My stomach dropped immediately because I knew exactly what was happening. Sarah was trying to win my mom over. My mom's the type of person who believes every conflict can be solved with a cup of tea and a heartfelt conversation, and Sarah knew how to play that card perfectly. When Sarah noticed me standing there, she said into the phone, "Yeah, he just got home. You should talk to him." And then, she handed me the phone. I was speechless for a second, but eventually took the phone from her. "Hey, Mom." Ethan. My mom's voice was soft, almost scolding. "Sarah's really struggling right now. Do you think maybe you could give her a little more time to figure things out? It's not easy just uprooting your whole life like this." My jaw clenched so hard I thought my teeth might crack. "Mom, she broke up with me. Why is this suddenly my responsibility?" "I know, honey, but you two were together for so long. It's not just black and white. Maybe you could." I cut her off. "No, Mom. I'm sorry, but no. This isn't her home anymore, and I'm not going to keep living like this. She has places she can go. She's just choosing not to." I handed the phone back to Sarah and walked into my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I couldn't believe the audacity. She wasn't just manipulating me anymore. She was pulling my family into this mess. The next morning, I woke up to find Sarah making breakfast in the kitchen like she didn't have a care in the world. Scrambled eggs, toast, coffee, the works. It felt so surreal watching her move around the kitchen we'd once shared as a happy couple. I couldn't take it anymore. Sarah, seriously, what are you doing? She froze mid-pour, coffee pot in hand, and looked at me like I was the crazy one. I thought we could have breakfast together. You're always so busy and… No, I said firmly, cutting her off. You're not getting it. This isn't your home anymore. We're not a couple. You can't just act like everything's normal. It's not normal. For the first time since this whole mess started, Sarah actually looked embarrassed. Or maybe she was just finally realizing I wasn't going to cave. Either way, she set down the coffee pot and walked back to her room without another word. That night, I came home to find her sitting at the dining table with 3 packed boxes next to her. It felt like progress, but I wasn't about to celebrate just yet. She looked up at me as I walked in. I'll be gone by tomorrow, she said quietly. I nodded. Okay. And then she added, but I'm not giving the ring back. I froze. I thought we'd already settled this, but apparently not. Sarah, the ring was for our wedding. There's no wedding anymore. She crossed her arms over her chest. You gave it to me. It's mine. No, I said, my voice sharp now. It's not yours. It was a symbol of a promise, and that promise is broken. You don't get to keep it just because you want to. For a second, I thought she might argue again, but instead, she just sighed, pulled the ring off her finger, and set it on the table. There. Happy now? I didn't say anything. I just picked up the ring, turned around, and walked straight into my bedroom. The next day, Sarah was gone. When I came home from work, the apartment felt eerily quiet. Her toothbrush was gone from the bathroom, her shoes weren't by the door, and there were no more empty coffee mugs left on the counter. It should have felt like relief, and in some ways it did, but mostly, it just felt empty, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I sat down on the couch, the same couch she'd been lounging on just the night before, and stared at the empty space where she'd always sat. It was over. Finally. But something told me this mess wasn't done with me yet. The first few days after Sarah left felt like a weird dream. Or maybe a nightmare. I'm not sure which. The apartment was so quiet it almost felt suffocating. No more muffled reality TV shows in the background. No random laughter from her phone calls with friends. No more of her things scattered across every flat surface. It was just silence. And for a little while, I thought maybe I could finally start to move on. But of course, life doesn't work that cleanly. At first, it was little things. I'd open a drawer and find one of her hair ties or her favorite mug shoved in the back of the cupboard. Her shampoo was still in the shower, her handwriting still on the sticky notes she'd leave on the fridge reminding me to pick up milk or eggs. You'd think those would just be minor annoyances, but every single one felt like a gut punch. Like she was still there somehow, lurking in the corners of my life. I decided I needed to clear it all out. Not out of anger or spite. I wasn't about to set her stuff on fire in the backyard or anything dramatic like that. I just needed to reclaim my space. So I started packing her things. Clothes, books, random knickknacks she'd collected over the years. Into boxes they went. It wasn't until I got to her nightstand that I found something I wasn't prepared for. A small leather-bound notebook. Now, I'm not the type to snoop. Or at least, I didn't think I was. But she'd left it behind, and it felt intentional. Like maybe she wanted me to find it. So yeah, I opened it. The first few pages were harmless. Random thoughts, grocery lists, sketches. But then I got to the middle, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't just some casual journal. It was basically a written record of every resentment, every complaint, every little crack in our relationship that I had either missed or ignored. He doesn't care about my needs. I'm so tired of being second to his job. Sometimes I wonder if he even loves me, or if he just likes the idea of us. Page after page, it was like peeling back a layer of skin and finding something raw and festering underneath. But the part that hit me the hardest was one sentence, scribbled in rushed handwriting. I've been thinking about ending things for months. I just don't know how to do it without looking like the bad guy. That one line stayed with me for days. She'd been mentally checked out for months. While I was out there grinding away at work, trying to build something for us, she was sitting at home writing about how she didn't know how to pull the plug without being the villain. I didn't know whether to feel angry, sad, or just stupid. How had I missed this? How had I not seen it coming? Maybe I was too focused on work, too busy trying to keep everything afloat to notice the cracks forming underneath me. I closed the notebook and shoved it into one of the boxes. I didn't want to look at it anymore. About a week later, Sarah texted me out of the blue. It wasn't an apology, or even an explanation. Nope. She wanted to know if she could come by and pick up some of her things. I told her sure, just let me know when. The last thing I wanted was to walk into my apartment one day and find her there unexpectedly. When she showed up, it was awkward, to say the least. She barely made eye contact as she walked in and started sorting through the boxes I'd packed for her. I stayed in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, watching her move through the space like she was some stranger in a house she used to know. At one point, she picked up that damn notebook. She froze when she saw it, then glanced over at me. I didn't say anything. I just waited. "You read this, didn't you?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "Yeah, I did." She looked down at the floor, like she couldn't decide whether to be embarrassed or angry. "I didn't mean for you to see that." "But you wrote it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You wrote all of it. And you stayed here, pretending everything was fine, for months." She didn't have anything to say to that. She just stood there, clutching the notebook to her chest. After what felt like forever, she finally spoke. "I didn't know how to end it without hurting you." I laughed, actually laughed, but not because it was funny. "You didn't want to hurt me? Sarah, you let me plan a wedding. You let me think we were building something real while you were sitting in the next room writing about how you didn't even know if you loved me anymore." She winced, and for a brief second, I thought I saw something like regret cross her face. But she didn't say anything else, just finished packing her things and left. The door closed behind her, and just like that, she was gone again. That night, I sat on the couch, staring at the boxes still piled by the door. I could still smell her perfume lingering in the air. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out my insides and left me with nothing but skin and bones. The next morning, I decided to text her one last time. Not to argue or demand answers, just to say goodbye. "Sarah, I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. I really do. Take care." She didn't reply. The weeks that followed were rough. I threw myself into work, picking up extra shifts whenever I could. Anything to keep my mind busy, to keep myself from replaying every conversation, every red flag I'd missed. My friends tried to get me out of the house, tried to distract me with beers and loud bars, but it was like I was only half there. One night, after closing up the restaurant, I sat in my car and just stared at the steering wheel. I thought about texting her, calling her, something, but I didn't. Instead, I turned on the ignition and drove home. That was the first night I felt like maybe, just maybe, I was starting to let go. But of course, Sarah wasn't done with me yet. The weeks after Sarah left were a blur. My days turned into a routine of long shifts at the restaurant, microwave dinners at midnight, and falling asleep on the couch with the TV still on. It wasn't exactly the healthiest coping mechanism, but it kept me from sitting in silence and thinking too much. At first, it felt like I was finally starting to get my space back. Her stuff was gone, her perfume wasn't lingering in the air anymore, and I wasn't walking on eggshells in my own apartment. But the thing about breakups is that the silence doesn't stay peaceful for long. Eventually, it starts to feel heavy. The messages from mutual friends started rolling in after about 2 weeks. You know the kind, casual at first, just checking in, asking how I was holding up. But then the tone started to shift. People were dropping little hints about Sarah, like, "Hey, have you talked to her? She's been having a hard time." Or, "She mentioned how much she's struggling with everything." At first, I shrugged it off. I wasn't about to let guilt creep back in. She broke up with me, after all. But the messages kept coming, and then they got worse. One of her friends, someone I barely even knew, sent me a long text accusing me of being cruel for making Sarah move out so quickly and demanding the ring back. Apparently, she'd been telling people that I'd kicked her out with nowhere to go, and snatched the ring off her finger like it was nothing. That's not how it happened, and I think deep down, even her friends must have known that. But perception is a powerful thing, and Sarah was always good at playing the victim when it suited her. I typed out a dozen different responses, ranging from angry paragraphs to cold one-liners, but in the end, I just left them all on read. There was no point in defending myself to people who had already made up their minds. But then Jenna, Sarah's best friend, texted me. Jenna and I never really got along. She was one of those people who always had something to say about everyone else's relationship but couldn't keep her own together for more than a few months. So when I saw her name pop up on my phone, I already knew it wasn't going to end well. Her message was predictably long and condescending, full of lines like, "You should have fought harder for her," and "If you really loved her, you wouldn't have let things end like this." But one part stuck out. "She's been really upset lately. Maybe you should reach out to her." It was like Jenna thought this was some rom-com where I'd show up at Sarah's door with flowers, and we'd have a tearful reunion in the rain. But this wasn't a movie. This was real life, and Sarah had made her choice. I didn't reply to Jenna. Instead, I tossed my phone onto the couch and tried to focus on anything else. But it didn't stop there. A few days later, I was at the restaurant in the middle of a busy dinner rush when my mom pulled me aside. She had that look, the one moms get when they have something to say but aren't sure how to bring it up. "I talked to Sarah yesterday," she said quietly. My stomach dropped. "Why?" "She called me," my mom said, her voice soft. "She said she just wanted to apologize for how things ended. She sounded really upset, Ethan. Like she regrets everything." I felt my jaw clench as I tried to process what she was saying. "So what? She's calling you now? Why didn't she call me if she wanted to apologize?" My mom sighed. "I don't know, honey. I think she's scared. Or maybe she just thought I'd be easier to talk to." I shook my head. "No, this isn't about regret. This is about her trying to control the narrative. She's telling everyone that I'm the bad guy, and now she's dragging you into it too." My mom frowned. "I don't think she's trying to manipulate me." "She is, Mom, and I'm done with it." I walked away before the conversation could go any further. I loved my mom, but she didn't understand. Sarah knew exactly what she was doing by calling her. She was planting seeds, trying to keep one foot in my life even after walking away. That night, I sat in my car after closing the restaurant and just stared at my phone. Part of me wanted to call Sarah and demand answers. Ask her why she was calling my mom, why she was telling people lies about me, why she was still clinging to the edges of my life like some ghost that refused to leave. But I didn't. I just scrolled through old messages between us until my vision blurred, and eventually, I shoved my phone into the glove box and drove home. The final straw came about a week later. I was out at a bar with some friends, trying to enjoy a rare night off. I was a few drinks in, laughing at some dumb joke one of my buddies made, when Mark, one of my oldest friends, pulled me aside. "Hey man," he said, looking uneasy. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you this, but I saw Sarah the other day, with someone else." I felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. "Who?" He shrugged. "Some guy. I don't know him, but they looked close." I nodded, trying to act like I didn't care, but the truth is, it hurt. Not because I wanted her back, but because it made everything feel so final. While I was here, picking up the pieces and trying to rebuild, she was already moving on. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the image from my head. Sarah with some guy, smiling, laughing, acting like none of this had ever happened. When I got home, I sat in the dark living room for hours, just staring at the wall. It wasn't about jealousy or even betrayal. It was about realizing that she'd been done with me long before she actually said the words out loud. She'd been planning her exit while I was still making plans for our future. That night, I decided I was done. Done trying to understand her. Done trying to defend myself to people who didn't know the full story. Done letting her take up space in my head. I blocked her number. Blocked Jenna's too, just for good measure. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just tired. Tired of holding on to something that wasn't mine to hold on to anymore. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in weeks. For the first time since everything fell apart, it felt like I could finally start moving forward. But even then, I had this nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Something told me this wasn't quite over yet. A couple of months passed, and things started to feel normal again. or at least as normal as they could after everything that happened. I'd settled into a routine: work, gym, dinner, sleep, repeat. It wasn't exciting, but it was steady. And honestly, steady was exactly what I needed. Sarah stopped popping up in my text notifications, mutual friends stopped reaching out with their guilt-trippy messages, and for the first time in a while, my head felt clear. I'd even started seeing some friends more regularly, grabbing beers after work or catching a late-night movie. It felt good to just exist without this heavy cloud of resentment hanging over me. But of course, the universe wasn't going to let me off that easy. One night, I was at the restaurant, finishing up a late shift. It was quiet. Most of the tables were empty, and the kitchen staff had already clocked out. I was just wiping down the bar when my cousin, Jake, walked in. Jake and I were close growing up. He was one of those cousins who felt more like a brother. But as adults, we drifted a little. Nothing dramatic, just life pulling us in different directions. He walked up to the bar, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, and gave me this awkward half-smile. "Hey man, got a minute?" I nodded and set down the rack. "Yeah, what's up?" He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder like he was checking to see if anyone else was around. "Look, I didn't want you to hear this from someone else, but I've been seeing Sarah." For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. Like, maybe my brain was still foggy from the long shift, and he'd said something completely different. But no, the words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. "You're what?" His face turned red, and he started stumbling over his words. "It wasn't planned, okay? We ran into each other a while back, started talking, and one thing led to another. I didn't mean for it to happen, but yeah." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Out of all the people in the world, it had to be Jake. My cousin. Someone who had been at our engagement party, who had toasted to our future, who had been right there through the entire mess of our breakup. For a long time, I didn't say anything. I just stared at him, trying to process the betrayal that was spreading through my chest like wildfire. "When were you gonna tell me?" I finally asked, my voice low. He shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know, man. I kept telling myself it wasn't serious, that it wasn't worth bringing up. But it's getting serious now." That hit harder than I expected. Serious. Like, he wasn't just casually hanging out with her. This was something real. Or at least, real enough that he felt the need to confess. I took a deep breath and leaned against the bar, trying to steady myself. "Do you have any idea how messed up this is, Jake? You don't date your cousin's ex-fiancée. You just don't." He looked down at his shoes like a scolded child. I know it's messed up, but it's not like I planned this. It just happened." That phrase, "it just happened," was starting to feel like a curse. Sarah had said the same thing when I confronted her about everything falling apart. Like emotions and choices just materialize out of thin air, and no one's responsible for anything. After a long silence, I shook my head. "You know what? I don't even want to hear it. Do whatever you want, man. Just don't talk to me about her again." Jake nodded and walked out, leaving me standing alone behind the bar, surrounded by the quiet hum of the restaurant's lights. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying our conversation over and over in my head. How long had it been going on? Had it started before Sarah even left? Had they been sneaking around behind my back while I was still trying to salvage our relationship? The next few days were rough. I avoided Jake's texts and stayed busy at work, trying to keep myself distracted. But the anger kept bubbling up, and eventually, I realized I wasn't going to be able to just let it go. So I texted Sarah. I know. Probably a bad idea, but I needed to hear it from her. I needed answers. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown. Neutral ground. When I walked in, she was already there, sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. She looked good, too good, honestly. Like she hadn't been losing sleep over this mess the way I had. I sat down across from her and got straight to the point. "Jake told me." She blinked, her face blank for a moment before she sighed and nodded. "I figured he would. How long has it been going on?" She hesitated. "A couple of months. After we broke up." "Are you serious about him?" She nodded again, this time more firmly. "Yeah, I am." I stared at her, trying to make sense of it all. You broke up with me because you couldn't handle my job, because you felt neglected, and now you're with my cousin? You don't see how messed up that is? She flinched slightly but didn't say anything. I trusted both of you, I said, my voice cracking despite my best efforts to stay calm. You weren't just my fiancé. You were supposed to be my partner. And Jake? He's family. You two were supposed to be the people I could count on. I'm sorry, she said softly. I never wanted to hurt you. I let out a sharp laugh. Well, mission failed. We sat there in silence for a long time, neither of us knowing what to say. Eventually, I stood up and grabbed my coat. Good luck, Sarah. I hope it was worth it. I walked out of that coffee shop and didn't look back. In the days that followed, I blocked both of them, Sarah and Jake. I didn't want to see their posts, didn't want updates from mutual friends, didn't want any part of their lives creeping into mine. It wasn't about being bitter or petty. It was about protecting my peace. I spent the next few weeks focusing on myself. I worked hard, spent time with friends who actually had my back, and started making plans for my future that didn't involve either of them. It wasn't easy. Some nights I'd still lie in bed and wonder how things had gone so wrong. But every day, it got a little bit better. They say time heals all wounds. I'm not sure I believe that entirely, but I do know this. Every day that passed, I felt a little less angry, a little less hurt, and a little more like myself again. A few more months passed, and the dust finally started to settle. Blocking Sarah and Jake was the best decision I could have made. Out of sight, out of mind, or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. I focused on work, spent more time with friends, and started to enjoy the quiet moments at home without feeling like I was walking through the ruins of my old life. But even when you think you're done with something, life has a way of testing you one last time. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in the middle of a rare day off. I just finished cleaning up the apartment. It was finally starting to feel like my space again, and was about to head out to meet some friends when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mom. Hey, Ethan, I need to talk to you about something. Call me when you can. My stomach immediately knotted up. Nothing good ever comes from a vague text like that. I called her back, pacing around my living room as the phone rang. When she picked up, her voice was hesitant. Honey, I didn't want to upset you, but Jake and Sarah are getting engaged. I stopped pacing. Everything went quiet except for the dull ringing in my ears. Engaged? I repeated, just to make sure I'd heard her right. Yes, she said softly. Jake told me last night. He said he thought you should hear it from family before it got around. I couldn't speak. My mind was blank, but my chest felt tight, like someone had cinched a belt around my ribcage. Are you okay, sweetheart? My mom asked. I swallowed hard and forced out a response. Yeah, I'm fine. But I wasn't. After I hung up, I just stood in the middle of my living room, staring at nothing. Sarah and Jake. Engaged. It felt like some kind of twisted joke, like the universe was pointing and laughing at me. I didn't tell anyone about the call for a few days. I went to work, acted normal around my friends, and pretended like everything was fine. But inside, I was spiraling. It wasn't that I still loved Sarah or even wanted her back. It wasn't about her. It was about the betrayal, the disrespect, the fact that two people I had trusted more than anyone had done this, and somehow managed to convince themselves it was okay. Eventually, I cracked. One night after closing the restaurant, I stayed late with Mark, my closest friend. We were sitting in the empty dining room with a couple of beers when I blurted it out. Jake and Sarah are getting engaged. Mark froze, his beer halfway to his mouth. Are you serious? Yep. I took a long swig from my bottle. My cousin and my ex-fiancé are getting married. What a world, huh? Mark set his beer down and shook his head. That's messed up. Like, really messed up. Tell me about it. For the next hour, Mark just let me vent. I told him everything. How I felt like an idiot for not seeing it sooner. How I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that they were moving on together. And how it felt like everyone else had just accepted it while I was stuck carrying all the emotional baggage. At one point, Mark said, you don't owe either of them anything, right? Not forgiveness, not closure, nothing. You can just let it go. That stuck with me. I realized then that I'd been holding on to this anger, this bitterness, like it was my job, I thought if I stayed mad, if I kept reminding myself how wrong they were, it would somehow balance the scales. But all it was doing was eating me alive. A couple of weeks later, I got an invitation in the mail. It was for their engagement party. An actual paper invitation, like they were some kind of royal couple. I stared at it for a long time before throwing it straight into the trash. But the weird thing? I didn't feel angry, just tired. The truth is, Jake and Sarah deserved each other. Two people who were comfortable crossing lines and betraying people they supposedly cared about. They were a perfect match, and I realized I didn't want any part of it. So I moved on. Really moved on this time. I stopped avoiding places where I thought I might run into them. I stopped wondering what people were saying behind my back, and I stopped replaying every detail of our breakup like it was some unsolvable mystery. I poured my energy into the restaurant, started working on some new menu ideas with my uncle, and even started looking at expanding the place in the next couple of years. I reconnected with old friends, started going out more, and somewhere along the way, I realized I was happy again. Not perfectly happy, because who really is? But content. One night, I was locking up the restaurant when I noticed a couple standing across the street, laughing and holding hands. For a split second, I thought it was Sarah and Jake, and my stomach tightened. But then the guy turned his head, and I realized it wasn't them. Just two strangers enjoying a moment together. I smiled and shook my head at myself. I'd been so sure they'd always be this looming shadow over me. But here I was, standing in the middle of my life, perfectly fine. A few months later, I heard through the grapevine that Sarah and Jake had gotten married. I didn't feel anything when I heard it. Not anger, not sadness, not even relief. Just nothing. And that was the best feeling of all. Looking back now, I realized that Sarah did me a favor. She showed me who she really was before we got married. Before we built a life together that would have inevitably crumbled under the weight of her expectations. And Jake? Well, he made his choice too. People like that, people who can lie to your face and justify their actions with cheap excuses, they don't deserve space in your life. I'm not saying I'm over it completely. Every now and then, something reminds me of her. A song, a scent, a random memory, and I feel a pang of something. But it passes. I'm okay now. Better than okay. Actually, at the end of the day, the biggest lesson I learned from all of this is that you can't control what other people do. You can't make someone stay, you can't make someone loyal, and you sure as hell can't make someone love you the way you deserve to be loved. But you can control how you respond. And I responded by letting go, by choosing myself. And honestly, that's the happiest ending I could have hoped for.